I'm reading a book by Vir Singh, edited by Lt Col GS Guleria. It is about Bhai Vir Singh ji. It's really interesting. I'm reading an article by Professor Prakash Singh, that is by Vir Singh's epic, Rana Surat Singh. He writes that Bhai Vir Singh began writing his voluminous book. This voluminous work in poetry, Rana Surat Singh, an epic in blank verse in 1902, and completed it in 1904. It was published in 1903 when Bhai Vir Singh was 33. This was his immediate success. This epic actually revolutionized Punjabi poetry, and its name was on everybody's lips in Punjab. Raminder Singh writes in the Sikh Review, October 1972, in this poem we behold Bhai Vir Singh's rising head and shoulder over all the other poets who have dealt with the realms beyond the physical body and their environment. We get an earlier feeling while reading Divine Comedy, Hamlet, Macbeth, and but not when we read Rana Surat Singh. Faust, F-A-U-S-T. F is, I couldn't read that. Faust, but not when we read Rana Surat Singh. On the other hand, feelings of spiritual wonder, vismad, overwhelm us. We feel spiritually uplifted while reading about the spiritual flights of Rani Raj Kaur. Epic poetry is the highest kind of poetry, and Bhai Vir Singh began with this form on which nobody had so far tried his hand at. This epic or Mahakavya changed the age-old tradition of Punjabi poetry and the whole traditional outlook of our women towards conjugal relationship. In the words of Teja Singh, what had been shyly approached as a feeling a few stolen moments of life became a very desirable domestic sentiment. Conjugal love was shown to be a stepping stone to the highest union with God. The book therefore came to be studied as a religious book, for the practical side of Sikhism is well represented in it. So, philosophy of love in the epic. That's what I'm reading. It's on page 368. Rana Surat Singh is a long epic poem narrating the pathetic separation of Rani Raj Kaur from her husband, Rana Surat Singh, on his death. She undergoes spiritual comfort and peace through love for the divine and through the company of the saints. Disregarding all the despondency and depression and performing all the worldly rites, worldly duties, she lives in the bliss and dies in beatitude. Rana Surat Singh embodies the principles of Gurbani for spiritual achievement, and the allegorical process of flight of the soul to the eternal being has been based upon the philosophy of Sikhism. Gurbani lays down that through devotion alone can an individual attain the perfect unity with the Supreme, and the first prerequisite of devotion is love. This is Guru Amar Das and Sri Rag. Bhai Vir Singh elucidates his philosophy of love in the preface of Rana Surat Singh. In this visible universe, love is an attainable an attraction that points towards the glimpse of the inevitable, of the invisible. It is such an energizing electric power that it creates form out of the formless and turns that into formless again. About the love depicted by Bhai Vir Singh in this epic, Puran Singh says, "The sole pure figure of this pang spiritual which makes beauty a new glory every day is Rani Raj Kaur, the art creation of a true disciple, character by Bhai Vir Singh, the great Sikh poet in his The Prince Beautiful, Rana Surat Singh, written in Punjabi. She is the Sikh heroine. Her love is deep and silent and vital and painful. It flourishes in the shade, in the glare it dies. Much too heavenly, much too musical to be announced so profanely. This relation of painful love is between the Guru and the Sikh. All love has its sacred privacy, and this too. In this love, art ceases and the artist glow to the whole art. Now the title. The name of the book, like his novels, is after the hero, Rana Surat Singh. He, from outward appearance, is responsible for all the developments of character in Rani Raj Kaur, his wife. But the real heroine is Rani Raj Kaur, in whom is centered all the interest of the story. As a matter of fact, the hero's character is static. He does not develop and remains almost the same throughout. Influence of Western literature. What was that in this particular thing? It goes without saying that the influence of Gurbani runs through almost all his verses, but a close scrutiny of his long poems reveal that the design and the treatment of the theme has been derived from the Western literature also, says Mohinder Pal Cooley. Bhai Vir Singh seems to have been influenced by Christian literature, which he must have read during his formative stage as a student in the Montessori school. The reading of the Bible was compulsory, and he was given a copy of the same by Principal Mackenzie at the time of his leaving the school. Punjabi translation of John Bunyan's, that is from 1628 to 1688, The Pilgrim's Progress, had appeared in 1859. The Pilgrim's Progress, written in 1678, is an allegory taking the form of a dream, narrating the journey of Christian from the world to that which is to come. So from this world to that which is to come. Rana Surat Singh too is an imaginative description of the journey of Rani Raj Kaur in dream. Rana Surat Singh, an epic in blank verse, is in the words of Dr. Mohinder Pal Cooley, is the odyssey of the pilgrim soul in quest of realization or nirvana. Its allegorical character and involved allusion remained one of the Spenser's Farsi Queenie. Even in his first long poem, Rana Surat Singh, the lyrical genius of Bhai Vir Singh is revealed in the description of sleep and the storm in the chapter of Pari Mahal Chari. By reading these, one is reminded of the lyrics of Wordsworth and Shelley. His poetry possesses the sublimity of Milton, the spontaneity of Wordsworth, the music of Tagore, and the mysticism of Keats. All these qualities of his poetry can be seen in his spiritual epic, Rana Surat Singh. Now, language and treatment. The epic has been divided into 35 chapters, and each chapter bears the heading denoting its subject. It contains altogether more than 14,000 lines. It is in blank verse, each line containing 20 syllables, with a seizure of at the 11th syllable. The language used is forceful. It has dramatic touches at many places, in the beginning of each chapter, and occasionally at other places. The author very successfully depicts charming scenes of nature, which not only beautify the story but also fit in with the changing moods of persons and the different phases of the story. As such, they are integral part of the whole theme. The beginning of the epic is imaginative and grippingly poetic. As the story advances, the intellectual element starts dominating the aesthetic element. In the end, there are religious and theological discussions. The mental flights at many places, and more so in the end, have been described very successfully. Strange story. A little bit. Now, what is this remarkable epic? Has a strange story which begins with the death of the hero. The heroine's character undergoes a great change. She changes inwardly. Her love in the beginning is just physical, but gradually it changes as she experiences stress of her husband's influence, which is exerted without physical contact. Rana Surat Singh is dead, but with her memory and her belief in his invisible presence, the love of Rani Raj Kaur becomes divine, so much so that she is saved by her divine love, and others who are inspired by her examples are also saved. In the beginning, Raj Kaur feels too much anguish of bodily separation from her husband, but gradually leaves the anguish aside as a feeling of his invisible presence and his influence over her brings her to peace. Widow Queen of the Rana ultimately puts her shoulder to the duties towards the kingdom which she is supposed to perform after the death of her husband. The story is imaginary, but it conforms to the epic, for it is connected with the historic times of the 18th century, when the incursus of Baba Banda Singh Bahadur spread terror in the hill areas of the north. During that time, a dying Raja of the small state nominated Surat Singh, his son-in-law, as his successor. Surat Singh was not a Rajput but a Sikh. The prestige of the Sikhs in the region was so great that the neighboring Rajas could not have the dare to create any trouble. After his father-in-law, Rana Surat Singh won the hearts of the people by good administration and his patriotic outlook. Throughout the epic, he is the ideal man. The heroine too gradually becomes perfect in love and attains an important position, no less than the hero himself. The first 3 or 4 chapters are full of pathos. The main interest of this epic is peacefulness and uplift of the character by the lofty teachings of the Gurus. The total effect is that it should be, with a successful epic, the promotion of righteousness. One of the features of the epic is that the hero should dominate the whole story and should never be out of the mind of the reader, says Teja Singh. And in the case of this epic, though Rana Surat Singh dies in the beginning of the story, but is ever dominant throughout the epic as a result of his invisible presence, which is felt by his widow, Rani Raj Kaur. His spirit has everlasting influence over the heroine and motivates all her actions. Lessons in Sikhism. The chapter on Raj Jog is the ideal of Sikhism. It is Bhai Vir Singh very forcefully tells that we are to live in this world like worldly men, but at the same time we are to remain detached, pure and above worldliness, as is the lotus in water. While performing all the worldly duties, a Sikh is to remain pure and virtuous, that he can achieve by following the path which Rani Raj Kaur, the heroine of this epic, follows. To sum up the path in a few words, we can say that it is the path of Naam or Simran, that is meditation or contemplation on God's name. There are many lessons or various religious subjects in the epic. For example, in Sangat, that is holy assembly or the congregation of the saintly people, the mind is purified and it gets positive virtues. Kirtan, that is singing of holy hymns, and Path, that is recitation of the Bani or the scriptures of the Gurus, grants strength of character for a virtuous life. The fundamental basis of Sikhism, Naam Japna, Kirt Karni, Van Chakna, that is meditating on the holy name, earning one's bread by honest labor, and sharing one's earning with the needy, and the elaboration of the first of the three there under the formula of Naam, Dan, Ishnan, that is contemplation, charity and purity, on which the Sikh way of life is based, have been interpreted by Bhai Vir Singh in his epic Rana Surat Singh, as have been done by him in his novel Baba Naud Singh. The symbolic flight of Rani Raj Kaur, directed by a celestial fairy through various stages of the development of soul, resting in Sachkhand, the final abode of the Rana, is an interpretation of the philosophy of the Japji as enumerated in the Pauris 33 to 37, where the 5 khands, that is Dharam Khand, Gyan Khand, Saram Khand, Karam and Sachkhand, have been described. To quote Lt Col Kohli, no doubt dream poetry or the motive of the flight of the soul are available in Indian mythology. The Garur Purana is an account of the journey of the soul after the physical death. It passes through different regions, finally settling either in the Supreme or taking a new birth. But Bhai Vir Singh does not show either the Rana or Raj Kaur taking a new birth. He intends to make them stay in Sachkhand, the region of the truth of Sikh religion. He does not seem to have been entirely influenced by the Purana, for there it is in it little of gloom and pessimism of the Purana. Rana Surat Singh and Divine Comedy. A comparison between Rana Surat Singh and Divine Comedy has been made by Lt Col Kohli in the following words. One is tempted to draw a comparison between Rana Surat Singh and the Italian poet Dante's epic poem Divine Comedy, written between 1307 to 21. There is little evidence so far to show that Bhai Vir Singh had read this book of the Italian author. Dante's condemnation of the other means of spiritual attainment, attainment than his own, finds a similar expression in this spiritual epic of Bhai Vir Singh. In the dialogues between Raj Kaur and the saint on the mountain, he rejects the Vaishnav, the Jain, the Buddhist, and the Nath ascetic methods of spiritual progress. The whole of Canto 12, Parimahal Parvesh, has been devoted to this extraneous purpose. The central figure in both the epics is a woman, Raj Kaur, residing in Sachkhand, and Dante's Beatrice in heaven. In the ninth and the final circle of the Divine Comedy, there is the vision of true paradise, comprehension and fruition, where man's will is set to rest in union with the universal good and his intellect in the possession of universal truth. Here God has beautified all the saints and angels in vision of his essence. Similar is the vision of Sachkhand in Rana Surat Singh, where Rani Raj Kaur undergoes 9 processes of devotion to reach the ideal of the final bliss. Divine Comedy set in the social setting of the Middle Ages that portrays the corruption of the Christian Church and Dante's hatred of Florence. Dante had a bitter experience of being exiled from Florence in 1301, and he does not spare those who are responsible for all his troubles. Rana Surat Singh, however, does not contain any such reference, history, or to religious or social problems of the time. Yet the similarity exists in as much as theme of both the poems are preparation for the life after death. Whole design of Rana Surat Singh gives a suggestion of the Divine Comedy under the overpowering influence of the Sikh ideals. He, Bhai Vir Singh that is, has not described the horrors of hell which Dante paints with terrific details. So writes Professor Prakash Singh. Must read this book. It's so interesting, really.